Good afternoon. I'm Sonia Michelle, Director of United States Studies here at the Wilson Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's discussion of a very important new book, The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History by Samuel Moyn. Before introducing the author and his commentators, let me say a few words about the Woodrow Wilson Center and its mission. The Wilson Center was established in 1968, largely at the behest of then White House staffer Daniel Patrick Moynihan, whose book of letters we'll be discussing here on Thursday, by the way, if you'd like to come to another book discussion this week. And Moynihan, who himself was a scholar politician, appreciated the unique and powerful combination of qualities in the man who was our 28th president, that is, the qualities of a scholar and a politician. Wilson, as many of you know, was the only president so far to hold a PhD. In Wilson's case, it was in history and political science. And before entering public office, he was a professor and then president of Princeton University. An avid student of public administration, he went on to practice what he had long studied, first as governor of New Jersey and then as president. The goal of the Wilson Center, then, is to embody these two strands of Wilson's life, scholarship and public policy, through what our current president and director, Lee Hamilton, likes to call democratic dialogue. And today's panel is one that I think will allow us to do just that. Samuel Moyn, the author of the book we're about to discuss, is a professor of history at Columbia University, where he works primarily on modern European intellectual history with a special focus on France and Germany. He also studies legal and political thought and Jewish studies. He is co-director of the Consortium for Intellectual and Cultural History at Columbia and editor of the journal Humanity. His publications include Origins of the Other, Emmanuel Levinas Between Revelation and Ethics, and a Holocaust Controversy, the Treblinka Affair in Post-War France. He's received a number of awards, including a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship and a Frederick Burkhardt Fellowship for recently tenured scholars. Our first commentator will be Jerry Z. Mueller, professor of history and chair of the Department of History at Catholic University here in D.C. His research focuses on modern European intellectual history and the history of modern Germany. His most recent publications include Capitalism and the Jews and The Mind and the Market, Capitalism and Modern European Thought. And most relevant to our discussion today, a 2008 article that appeared in Foreign Affairs and was much commented on, which is entitled Us and Them, The Enduring Power of Ethnic Nationalism. Professor Mueller has received fellowships from the American Academy in Berlin, the Rockefeller Foundation Center in Bellagio, Italy, the Olin Foundation, the Bradley Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Our second commentator will be Rosa Brooks, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Rule of Law and International Humanitarian Policy and Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Previously, she was in the Department of Defense. Previously, she was Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the Human Rights Institute at Georgetown University Law Center. She has also served as a Senior Advisor at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, as well as consultant for the Open Society Institute and Human Rights Watch. She has written numerous scholarly articles on international law, human rights, and the laws of war, and her book, Can Might Make Right? The Rule of Law After Military Interventions, was published in 2006. So as you can see, our panelists are well prepared to bring both scholarly and public policy perspectives to the topic at hand. Moreover, the subject of this book, Human Rights in History, is one that is particularly appropriate for the Wilson Center, since Woodrow Wilson, as Professor Moyn notes at several points in his book, played a key role in the 20th century struggle to create an international order. Although Wilson failed in his efforts to bring the U.S. into the League of Nations, the Wilsonian moment, as it came to be called, marks an important phase in global history, one that the international community has been attempting to recapture ever since. As Professor Moyn will no doubt explain, this effort is germane to the history he offers in his book, a history that he recounts in a way that is fresh and I'm sure will be to many of you quite thought-provoking. Professor Moyn will speak for about half an hour, followed by comments by Professors Mueller and Brooks of about 15 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. After that, we invite you to join us for wine and cheese, during which time copies of the book will be available for purchase and signing by the author. So I'm happy to turn the floor over to Samuel Moyn. Sure, yeah.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to Sonia for organizing this event, and in advance to the two commentators, whatever they say. So this book is an attempt by a professional historian to do a dispassionate reckoning of where international human rights fit as a set of concepts, but also as a set of practices in modern political history. Now, historians haven't done this project until the last 10 years, when they started to do it in droves due to the public prominence of international human rights. And my book is in part a response to the first tries at constructing this field. And it worries that historians so far have drastically overstated the sources in the past for these contemporary beliefs and activities. So it's not at all that there aren't precedents for international human rights in their public prominence today, but that you sort of have to squint hard to see them flowing out of some long and rich tradition. In response, my book puts the accent on what I think of as the real era in which international human rights finally became prominent, the 1970s, so as to show how recent they are, and if you'll excuse a kind of academic word, how contingent they are. It's only in that era, the 1970s, that the phrase human rights in English became part of common speech. And my big claim is that human rights become so prominent, not because they were the first idealism adopted by human beings, but nearly the last one, after other things that had been exciting and galvanizing first failed. So to put this claim in perspective, I'm going to take a long view and a short view, starting with the long view for just a few minutes, and then dwelling a bit more on the short-term period after World War II, when we're looking for the rise of human rights as a new set of concepts and a kind of new public optic, including one that affects policymaking in the U.S. government. So how do we think about the relevance of the deep past prior to, say, World War II to international human rights today? Most historians have adopted the strategy of looking for a one-time breakthrough at some point in the past when common humanity came into view. And then they've disputed whether that happened with the Greeks or the Jews or the Christians and so forth. The worry here is that that maybe universalism of that sort doesn't need to be discovered, or if it does, there are lots of different contending universalisms in human history almost from the start. A very large number of ideologies in human history share the principle that human beings are part of the same family as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 tells us, but they diverge from there on what this means in practice. And so if that's the case, then I pose the question about origins differently. It's how did all the old versions of universalism go away to give rise to our version of common humanity associated with human rights, and in particular international human rights? You might say the right question is what the relationship is between the universalism embodied in our idea of international human rights protected sometimes across borders by international law, and those older schemes, religious or secular. And what made those, which were dominant before, leave a space for our new way of thinking about a global moral and possibly legal order? Now, this sounds very abstract, but let me turn to modern history, leaving aside all these old sources, to think about the history of rights. Because, of course, it's true that rights, even natural rights, are very old ideas. There's even a dispute within the Academy about how exactly old there are, although most people trace them to 17th century philosophy and figures like Hugo Grotius, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke. But when we think about this concept of natural rights in the 17th century or in the 18th century, when it informed revolution across the Atlantic, it seems ultimately like the concept is very different in its practical implications from what we now mean by international human rights. Most of all, these rights, which you could call revolutionary rights, were about the construction of the state, not the transcendence, even partially, of the state. In the American Revolution, the point was to invoke rights in the name of violence, the violent overthrow of an empire in the name of the autonomy of a colonial people. And in the French Revolution, the point was to overthrow a creaky monarchy in the name of a new order, again, with violence explicitly contemplated as a tool. So if you were for natural rights, as the Americans said they were in their revolution, or the rights of man, as the French said they were, droits de l'homme, in their revolution, your goal was state foundation, and certainly in the French case, national incorporation through violence, if necessary. If we think about this concept then of natural rights, it seems pretty different from what human rights now mean, not just conceptually, but at the level of practices. You could think of this in a different way by asking why there was no human rights movement associated with the revolutions of that era or coming about soon after. Maybe there was. I like to say that there was no human rights movement in the 18th or 19th century, but there was a rights of man movement, which was about revolutionary state foundation and national incorporation. Always rights were invoked, and maybe the human identity of those who were supposed to get them mattered for a bit. But the outcome was always the creation of a territorially bounded citizenship space. Rights then were, if you like, in the cause of sovereignty, not a concept to qualify or overcome sovereignty, except to replace it with some other sovereign state or nation state. If there was a rights of man movement, it was nationalistic, because this was the real meaning of rights, even the rights of man in the 19th century. So in the book, I talk about the most inspirational figure in this line of thinking, this Italian nationalist named Giuseppe Mazzini, who thought the rights of man were an exciting concept. The individual is sacred, he says, and he makes a banner for his human rights of man movement, which has liberty, equality, humanity on one side. But on the other of this banner for young Italy, he has unity, independence, as if what it means to be for humanity, indeed the rights of man, is the creation of a state, and at this point, a nation state. And of course, he was also an early theoretician of insurrection or insurgency, or what we would now call terrorism, in the name of the liberation of his people and the construction of a nation state that would be the forum for its rights. It seems as if we're honest. It seems as if most, if not all, late 18th and 19th century struggles for rights or the rights of man were struggles for the state, or struggles about the meaning of citizenship within it. And if this is all correct, then it seems to me that the upsurge of international human rights at some point in the 20th century, in particular creating norms in international law above the state, is something different. If the new search is for mechanisms for correcting and constraining sovereignty, not from within, which has an old history, but from without, then it's got to be because the rights of man lose their prominence and human rights, in a sense, take their place. This is, of course, a distinction that's available in English, and I think we're lucky to have it because we get at two very different sorts of ideas, and in particular, two different movements based on them. You might ask why rights of man movements go away and human rights movements come about. And so this is meant to be an illustration of the larger argument I made at the start. We're not looking for the working out of one idea of common humanity, but the replacement of one version of that idea by another. And so that's what I want to look at now, turning to 20th century history. Now, 20th century history is itself a very contested field for thinking about where human rights fit. The lion's share of the attention, when it doesn't fall on even earlier things, falls on the 1940s. And of course, it's clear why that should be. In 1948, there was a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that should count, and of course it does. In this first stage, because I'll discuss 3 stages in the 20th century, it's true that the phrase human rights is introduced for the first time in English, a few earlier, almost random uses aside. Typically, when we come to the 40s, the story is then one of kind of enunciation or breakthrough, starting with the Atlantic Charter between FDR and Winston Churchill in 1941, which announced war aims, even though, of course, America hadn't been driven into war, and then culminating in the 1948 Universal Declaration. So I've tried to qualify that story a bit in my book, because I think the most significant aspect of the story of human rights in the 40s is that no one cared, and that somehow the public prominence of this phrase and idea, as well as the practices we now associate with it, were reserved or postponed for a later time. So how to think about the 40s? Well, I would break it down into 2 stages. In the first stage, associated with the Atlantic Charter and FDR's famous 4 freedoms, the dominant wartime public meaning of the phrase human rights, which is not very prominent by itself, is welfarism or social democracy. The sense is that the world has been brought low and thrown into global war again because of earlier economic arrangements which collapsed in the Great Depression. And the promise is that if you fight, you will gain, if not a social democracy, then some welfarist democracy. But 2 things happen in the 40s, which I think are quite significant for understanding why human rights per se, especially as an international project, is almost stillborn. One is that the nature of the promise made in the world changes in the course of the 40s. So the Atlantic Charter had announced not human rights, but as part of the 4 freedoms, it announced a collective self-determination. But Winston Churchill didn't mean self-determination for the whole world, and he was surprised when anyone thought so. He thought that phrase applied to Adolf Hitler's captured empire in the east of Europe, not to his empire, and not to empire as a whole. And so the striking thing is that the Atlantic Charter, which had featured self-determination, sets the world on fire. We can see that through its reception around the world. But if you like, human rights enter the world as a self-determination disappears from it, as that promise, if you like, is taken back or taken off the table. And not surprisingly then, human rights don't make any big impact on global rhetoric in the 40s. If you like, they're rejected by most of the world living under empire as a consolation prize. But then think about the developed world. On the one hand, there's the complex history, which I'll have to skirt here, of the formation of the United Nations, which ends up really subordinating this idea of human rights within the United Nations Charter to the point of being kind of ornamental symbolism. But what about the public role of the notion of human rights in the developed world? Instead, I think it was uninteresting here and across the Atlantic because people were almost more interested in the welfarism or social democracy with which the phrase was linked at the outset of the 40s. But the difficulty was that it wasn't clear what it would mean to construct a welfarist democracy or a social democracy. In particular, given the appeal of communism globally. There was a political question, especially in Western Europe, what kind of social democracy to to bring about? Would it just correct capitalism or overturn it? And a moral language like human rights, announcing standards above politics, really didn't offer much in facing this choice at a moment when people were still confused or not honest about the nature of communism. Since, after all, the Soviet Union was just as much for human rights, at least on paper, as other countries. If they abstained from the Universal Declaration in 1948, it was because they were angry that self-determination had been taken out of the picture. And for that reason, they won lots of support around the world in later struggles, including at the United Nations. Never in the 40s, unlike later in history, were human rights thought to be necessarily about putting authority above the state, especially legal authority. And never did they acquire popular backing. There's no human rights movement in the 40s. Finally, they weren't part of post-Holocaust recoil, even though we tend to link human rights and the Holocaust. I think they're much more associated with social democracy and how to construct it. And as I've suggested, linked so closely that they're, in a sense, ignored because they don't help us choose what kind of social democracy, or at least contemporaries didn't think so. So then we move to the second two stages and why it was the 70s in which this phrase becomes so prominent, both on the ground in new grassroots social movements and in the sky at the pinnacles of public authority, especially in Jimmy Carter's association, unprecedented, of this nation with human rights policy. So let's consider a couple of aspects. I think a first aspect is that anti-colonialism has declined as a model and threat. Since after the 40s, the UN General Assembly became populated by new states, which essentially captured the notion of human rights, which had no meaning anywhere else in the world. They injected self-determination back when it had been severed from human rights in the 40s. Indeed, if you look at the UN covenants for human rights, the promise of collective self-determination is the very first right. And yet, it was felt in the North Atlantic world that this made the UN General Assembly and its human rights processes very hypocritical. Human rights mainly became a kind of tool of anti-colonialism directed at South Africa and even Israel. And Westerners in the 70s had a new insight that maybe they ought to stand up for human rights in a new way and not let them be sacrificed as they were being sacrificed at the United Nations on the altar, as they saw it, of self-determination around the world. This is what Arthur Schlesinger Jr. says in 1977, which are really the breakthrough months for human rights. He says, "We've learned that states, decolonizing states, may meet all the criteria for self-determination and still be blots on the planet. Human rights is the way of reaching the deeper principle, which is individual self-determination." So in terms of the argument I laid out at the beginning, you could say that decolonization was the last rights of man movement about setting up states and citizenship spaces. But it was also the last gasp of the rights of man as an idea. And human rights comes about because this no longer seems sufficient. States can be bad, and we might need some tools, including tools in international law and organization, to interfere from above with states when they fail. But that's only one part of the picture in the 70s, because there's also a kind of new way of thinking about human rights as a new galvanizing idealism that unites people beyond borders, including international lawyers for the first time. And so I want to look at this more positive development, which I think matters even more against the backdrop of the crisis of decolonization and the goal to find some alternative to it. So by the 70s, the Cold War is still going on, obviously, but its terms have become unconvincing to large swaths of population. There's unprecedented dissent against the Cold War order in the 1960s, notably in 1968. Yet remarkably, international human rights aren't an international public language of dissent of note in that era, as if they're still waiting for some further conditions. And my suggestion is that those further conditions are really in the collapse of the first alternatives to the Cold War, dissent models like Marxist humanism or reform communism behind the Iron Curtain, and all the sorts of ideologies that we associate with the student movements and widespread dissent in the 60s. In the 70s, at any rate, it's clear that human rights as an idea acquires a grassroots social movement backing it had never had, certainly not in the 40s. Amnesty International had been founded a bit before, but its membership, especially in this country, skyrockets after 1971. And of course, it wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1977. Some of the major events we would want to look at in detail would be the campaign against torture, which is in the early 70s, and then after the coups in Uruguay and Chile in 1973, lots of new transnational activism around the exiled and brutally hurt or killed citizens of those places. And then there are the politicians who, again, aside from some throwaway lines in American history, begin to define their policies in terms of human rights and create new aspects or offices within the American government. And Rosa might want to tell us what's happened with those in the last few decades. How do we think about this breakthrough, which is on the ground and in the air, or at the pinnacle? So I want to propose two main ideas. One is that the United Nations is bypassed. It had been, since the time of the 1940s, kind of like the proprietary owner of the notion of international human rights. Yet the language had, in a sense, gone there to die. And the big significance of amnesty is that spaces for invoking the idea outside United Nations processes were forged. And of course, Jimmy Carter and some slightly earlier figures in the Democratic Party strove to do so too within the American state. In this case, I think we come back to the anti-colonialist capture I mentioned. People sought an alternative to the UN precisely because the UN Human Rights Commission at that point and associated bodies seemed so hypocritical with a double standard, unwilling to look at the new states and their human rights abuses. And in the 1970s, NGOs conclude very clearly that they can't keep trying to reform the United Nations. They need to adopt new tactics. And these include the famous activities of information gathering, naming, and shaming, as well as the more grassroots activities like lighting candles and adopting prisoners of conscience associated with Amnesty International. But maybe the bigger factor is the new notion of what human rights, international human rights, might mean in the world in an era when these prior alternatives of dissent have been tried and failed. The main breakthrough there is really behind the Iron Curtain, amongst a set of people we now know as dissidents who become kind of romantic heroes of the age for grassroots movements in the North Atlantic world, and they're also invited to the White House and so forth. We can understand their move to human rights as part of a big picture that I think is common to the 70s, which is one of what you might call political foreclosure and the search for a moral alternative. Now, that meant that prior to the 1968, the alternatives to the Soviet Union that dissidents adopted were political. They were like a different model of communism. But the tanks in the streets of Prague in 1968 convinced dissidents that that's not going to work. And so they adopt human rights. Now, on accident, really. Long before the U.S. even contemplated signing the UN covenants on human rights, the Soviet Union did so and advertised that it had done so in Pravda. And dissidents who had never heard of the Universal Declaration began to invoke international human rights commitments against their own state, not just civil protections from the Soviet Constitution. But they were always presented as moral limits, not as a political alternative. And all the dissidents think so. Most famously, a bit later, in the late 70s, Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia. I think we can see something similar in Latin America. I'll just mention that briefly. In the North Atlantic area, after Amnesty International's model, human rights seem to be, for activists on the ground, about replacing failed maximalist models of political transformation from the 60s with minimalist models, what one Amnesty activist calls saving the world one person at a time. It's not about grandiose political revolution, but some kind of moral critique from those out of power. Now that's brief, of course, because almost immediately Jimmy Carter, who's, as the president, someone very powerful, signs the United States on to human rights with a few precedents. In this country, in this city, human rights have to be associated mainly, I think, with a post-Vietnam context, with the desire to save the reputation of the United States after an era of bloody power politics, in the hopes that, unlike the Soviet Union, the United States could show that it obeyed moral norms in conducting its foreign policy. And of course, this was a very short-lived phenomenon. The conditions that crystallized for Jimmy Carter's moralism in power were almost fracturing by the time he entered office. And as one historian says, the country was returning to its normal condition almost immediately. It didn't make sense to assail American wickedness. In the mid-'70s, in late 1976 and possibly early 1977, that did make sense. So you can see how I'd want to connect him to the larger picture, because also in the American case, human rights come to the public as a moral response to the failures of prior power politics. Human Rights Watch is founded in 1978 in the kind of afterglow of this major public debate over the injection of human rights into American foreign policy. Now let me just close, because I'm right at the end, by noting a big irony of the story I've been trying to tell, which of course doesn't really get us past the late 1970s. My claim is that the emergence of human rights as a public language happens when old options have failed. And yet, if we think back to the 40s, we see a kind of paradox or irony. After all, there'd been a moral claim in the 1940s to transcend politics associated with the new idea of human rights, but people had ignored it. They wanted a political option, a new sort of society that would make good on wartime promises. And moralistic languages didn't help make that political choice. But then here's the irony. In the 1970s, for the same reason, human rights become terrifically powerful as a public language. People have lost their taste, you might say, for political options. And the notion of a moral alternative becomes much more salient than it had ever been. It activates a grassroots movement, and it becomes, at least at the start, the basis for presidential invocation. Now, I do have some ideas for how this history, if it's right, might affect the way we think about the legacy of this 1970s moment, and we can come back to this. My main goal as a historian has been to try to look at how human rights, in a sense, came to the world in the first place. What their fate is now and in the future, I have no idea. So I'll stop there and hear from the commentators.
Thank you very much. Jerry, do you want to? This is yours.
Well, Professor Moyn has written a remarkably wide-ranging, erudite, thoughtful, and intellectually stimulating book, of which he's just given you a small flavor of the range of topics and the range of analysis that one finds. It's a curious book, though, in many respects. It's a book that is argued, that has a key thesis that it argues with forensic force, and yet it is ambivalent, perhaps fruitfully ambivalent, at the same time, and I want to draw out some of those ambivalences. Professor Moyn's key optic, his key perspective on this history of human rights, is to take the meaning of the term human rights that developed in the mid-1970s, which curiously enough he never quite defines, but it's clear enough what he means, that is international legal protection for individuals with appeals to international courts and international public opinion rather than to sovereign states, to take that conception of human rights and to show that that conception of human rights, far from continuous with older notions, was in fact quite novel. And he uses that conception, that mid-1970s conception of human rights, as a kind of measure or template to show that what seemed to us to be previous near synonyms, in fact, meant something quite different. And hence the forensic tone of much of the volume. It's almost written, parts of it are almost written as a brief, showing the factual inaccuracy of previous interpretations that try to see human rights as continuous with these prior claims centered around terms like the rights of man and so on. In doing that, the book provides a history of conceptions of natural law, of natural rights, of the rights of man, and so on, with an emphasis on their difference from the meaning that the terms came to have in the 1970s. Again, above all, because these earlier terms all referred primarily to sovereign states, that is to say, to rights that were to be guaranteed by sovereign states, rather than a set of rights to be presented in some ways as a challenge to the sovereignty of sovereign states. Because of the wide-ranging survey and analytic acumen that's brought to bear on the history of these concepts, the book is subject to perhaps alternative constructions and interpretations. With a slight change of optic, one could see the 1970s meaning as one variation, or at least one transmogrification, of older patterns. He has a key insight. One has the feeling that he had a sort of aha moment, and that the book grew out of that. And that key insight has to do with this breakthrough moment of the early to mid-1970s, centered in his account on Amnesty International. And the key insight was, and the key insight of the book is, that this novel movement and this novel conception of human rights arose from disillusionment with previous ideologies, above all with various forms of radical socialism, with the New Left, and with anti-colonial struggles. It has its origins, he writes, in the new social movements, but, and these are his words, they're very acutely formulated, but this new conception of human rights was as much the beneficiary of collapse of the countercultural explosion as a set of idealistic causes as it was part of that outburst. In other words, it was embraced by substantial groups of people. Above all, he has in mind people in Western Europe and in the United States who grew out of the New Left and the student left, but in one way or another had become disillusioned with the grand ideological designs floating around in it. And that then set the stage, or together with that, there came certain strategic processes that were going on in the Soviet bloc on one hand and in Latin America on the other, where for strategic reasons, at least in the first instance, both Eastern Bloc dissidents and Latin American leftists facing repression by authoritarian governments embraced these ideas of human rights, even though they hadn't necessarily been part of their particular traditions. And all of this comes together then, as I say, in Amnesty International, the 1976 Amnesty International campaign against torture, and so on. That's the aha moment and the aha insight, which is, as I say, argued with great force in virtually every chapter of the book. There's a certain ambivalence that comes in with regard to this new meaning of human rights, this new meaning that it took on in the 1970s. And that ambivalence is reflected in the title of the book. By referring to these rights in this movement as the last utopia, Professor Moyn seems to mean at least two things. First of all, it was utopian in the sense of trying to transcend the present order, and trying to transcend the present order with a hope for a better future. But there's also a second implication in his terminology of this as the last utopia, and that is, of course, the more common meaning of utopia, as something that can't in fact be realized anywhere. And Professor Moyn suggests, tentatively and somewhat timidly, two critiques of all of this. First of all, he raises the issue of the effectiveness of this new conception of human rights. As he puts it about 3/4 of the way through the book, whether or not such activism made a difference on the ground or in the larger process of constructing international norms, it succeeded first of all in giving meaning to engaged lives, which is to say, human rights in this sense works well as a form of therapy or individual moral self-actualization. Also, the issue of the effectiveness of all of this is raised somewhat tacitly in the book, I would say, by the conceptual effectiveness of the critiques of these conceptions of human rights not based upon national sovereignty that are offered by many international lawyers and theorists of international relations who Professor Moyn quotes in the book. When you add the cogency of the critique of enforceable rights divorced from the power of national states, which, as I say, he recounts without endorsing, one has reason to note a certain degree of a kind of tentative critique of all of this. And then, perhaps between the lines of the discussion of international human rights, one finds, and as I say, this is perhaps ranging on the interpretation of Professor Moyn's book rather than the direct explication of it, but it's certainly suggested by a reading of a book, a kind of Foucaultian linkage of knowledge and power. That is, the attempt by international lawyers to aggrandize power at the expense of national sovereign organizations. And one finds a description of a kind of trinity of law professors, NGO bureaucracies, and government officials. Many of those government officials made up of people in the other two categories, that is, law professors and previous incumbents of NGO bureaucracies, creating a kind of new class of Platonic guardians. All of this indicates, I think, the richness of the book, how suggestive it is, as well as how erudite it is and how analytically acute it is. My main criticism of the book is that he repeatedly portrays the human rights movement as equally disillusioned with both major protagonists in the Cold War. That is to say, communism and its offshoots on the one hand, and implicitly at least, Western liberal democracies on the other. But as he puts it, human rights emerged out of exasperation with the Cold War and the hope for a way beyond its divisions. That's certainly true for part of the human rights movement. But what this seems to me to do is to downplay the role of the protection or the creation of regimes of individual rights by Cold Warriors, which they attempted to do by suppressing, not by suppressing, by superseding communist regimes. And indeed, many people involved in the history of the Cold War on the Western side were very much concerned with these kinds of rights, though they were concerned with them, though they didn't think that the way to bring them about was most effectively through appeals to international courts or even to international public opinion, though that did play some role, obviously, in their strategy, but to try to change the regimes in question. One thinks, for example, of a man like Irving Brown of the AFL-CIO, an old ex-communist and former pupil of J. Lovestone, who worked over many decades with labor movements in Western Europe and then eventually in Eastern Europe to try to bring down communism and replace it with something better. At the time that these major protagonists of Professor Moyn's book were most active in the late 70s and early 80s, Irving Brown was busy surreptitiously trying to get photocopy machines to successfully trying to get photocopy machines to Solidarity and similar movements in Eastern Europe. Indeed, one could easily get the impression from Professor Moyn's account that Václav Havel became president of his country because of Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, rather than because of the collapse of Soviet power and the will to domination within the Soviet Union himself. There's also no discussion of why the moment of Carter's emphasis on human rights in international relations, in American international policy, was so short-lived, namely because the policy was widely interpreted as having been superseded by larger concerns, such as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan or the events in Iran at the time. In short, my criticism of a book that, as I say, I think has tremendous strengths and is tremendously stimulating, is that there's too little discussion of the role of power, either military power or economic power, in bringing about the kinds of improvements in human rights that the book discusses. In short, I think it's a terrific book about the history of ideas and discourses, but that there's too little on the effects of these ideas on the actual world and on the power dynamics that made those ideas either effective or ineffective. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Well, I'm not a historian. I'm a law professor and currently a policy wonk type. And at various points in my career, I've been an advocate and a journalist. So I'm going to speak from those various perspectives. And I should the mandatory disclaimer emphasize that I am speaking from my personal perspective, not from the perspective of the Defense Department, the Obama administration, et cetera, on these issues. But let me start by saying, as a non-historian, I don't feel particularly qualified to evaluate the strictly historical claims about the degree to which current human rights discourses and frameworks can or can't trace their pedigrees directly to previous versions of that sort of discourse. I am also not all terribly convinced that it matters from the perspectives that I come from. I think that human history and ideology is a giant grab bag, and to me it's not terribly important whether or not there is an unbroken neat line from ancient Greece to the International Criminal Court, or whether, in fact, we have a far more diffuse, far less connected, far less continuous series of visions, of commentaries. The line gets broken at various points. It gets picked up again by someone else somewhere else who picks up little pieces here and there, and then it gets woven together. To me, that's not particularly relevant. But I will say, again, with the caution that comes from not being a historian, that I think there is one causal piece in here that maybe you underestimate, and here what I'm thinking of is technological changes. I mean, if you're asking the question, why is it that this particular understanding of human rights as a sovereignty-limiting doctrine, not as some understanding of natural rights that gives rise to a vision of a democratic state and the powers that then accrue to that state that flow from individual rights, but rather an understanding of human rights as something that is above the state, that should at least reach into the state to prevent the state, to constrain the state in various ways. It seems to me that one of the things that you look at when you say, well, gosh, how come we only see that notion of human rights as a sovereignty limiting doctrine rising over the course of the last 30, 40 years rather than prior to that, I think has something to do with the fact that we live in for reasons that have more to do with technology than with anything else, that we live in a world in which the ability, in which knowledge travels differently. This is the obvious point. We now have the capacity, sitting in our living rooms, to know almost instantly what is happening in far-flung corners of the world. We know what is happening to some extent, or at least we don't know as much as we sometimes think that we know. But in Kandahar, in Tiananmen Square, in Vietnam, that between the rise of television, the rise of the fax machine, the rise of the internet, the rise of relatively cheap and easy air travel, et cetera, that all of these things, and this is, again, this is a truism at this point, they shrink our world. They enable us to know much more quickly and in a much more vivid and visual sort of way what is going on in other places, what horrifically bad things are happening to other people, what forms of state repression are ongoing, what sorts of violence by non-state actors are ongoing. At the very same time, many of these same technological changes means that the ability of a state, any state, to be a fortress, to say, you guys do what you want over there, we're going to do what we want over here, just diminishes dramatically. Whether you want to think of it from a public health perspective, flows of disease, or from a weapons proliferation perspective, or from an ideological perspective, that suddenly, or from an environmental perspective, climate change, et cetera, on every possible level, not only do we now know what is happening in other states, but we all recognize, and I think at this point, and this is a recognition I think that becomes very visceral during the 1990s. Before then is largely theoretical, becomes very deeply felt during the 1990s. We all viscerally understand that what the decisions made in one state could affect all of us very quickly. So to me, I think that that's one of the causal strands in why do we suddenly have much more energy behind a range of sovereignty-limiting doctrines. And I don't believe that we see them just in the dimension of human rights. And indeed, I think one of the rather interesting, rather troubling nexuses that we see between the humanitarian and human rights discourse on the one hand and a much more hard security-oriented discourse on the other hand is we see a sort of convergence of sovereignty-limiting doctrines. And here I'm referring to think about the counterterrorism discourse, where there clearly is an intellectual strand that is behind many of the United States actions in the post-9/11 world that goes more or less like this and is articulated more or less like this. It is essentially saying, well, security threats in one place can affect the rest of the world, and if a sovereign state is unwilling or unable to act to control, stamp out, tamp down threatening activities within its borders by terror, e.g. the Al-Qaeda cell in place X, wherever it is, if they're unable to do it, other states and or the international community and or individual other states with the capacity have a right and arguably a duty to do it for them, which is not dissimilar intellectually from the argument that we see coming out in various humanitarian and human rights discourses, such as the so-called responsibility to protect, R2P, as it gets nicknamed annoyingly, with a little number 2. Which essentially says when a state fails to act to protect its own populations, that the international community / potentially individual states or groups of states have the obligation, have the right and maybe the obligation to intervene. So anyway, this is all just to say that I think that there is more to the story of why do we suddenly, beginning in the 1970s, really sort of exploding in the 1990s, see an intellectual interest, see a popular interest, etc., in a variety of sovereignty-limiting doctrines, in a variety of visions that say, wait a minute, it can't all be about states. There must be some role for powers, for rights, for conceptions of justice, of security, et cetera, that exist outside of the state. And I think that that's very powerful, and it's one that goes relatively unmentioned in the book. I don't think that display, I think that doesn't argue against the points that you make, Sam, but it's just another piece of the story that doesn't get explored very much. I do very much agree that part of what, I agree I think I agree, that part of what additionally gives energy to that human rights discourse is ironically its status as a form of anti-politics. That they're precisely as Sam argues very effectively, fatigue sets in, disillusionment sets in with the sort of more totalizing ideologies that characterize the Cold War period. And one of the great promises of the human rights discourse is that it lets you get away from that, at least in theory, right? It lets you say, this has got nothing to do with communism, it's got nothing to do with capitalism, it's got nothing to do with any particular ism. This is about neutral concepts such as rights, and as such, it's a very attractive rhetorical ground. I think even in a very nitty-gritty and pragmatic sense, in this country, we have seen it used as an alternative discourse in all sorts of sectors, whether you want to look at anti-poverty movements in this country, or criminal justice reform movements in this country, or anti-gender violence movements. All of those groups have at various points seized upon the rhetoric of human rights and the legalistic framing of human rights as a way to get a rather fatigued public audience to say, aha, this isn't the same old people making the same old tired arguments. This is something this is something different. This is something new. This is something that Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals alike can unite behind. And for that reason, I think it's been both very appealing and very powerful. At the same time, and I think this is something that is teased out towards the end of the book, that very strength of the idea of human rights as existing beyond politics, existing in the realm of pure morality and law, legal concept, is not only a great strength, it's also fundamentally misleading and one of the most profound limitations of the human rights discourse at the same time, that it only takes you so far. And there, I think, two strands of that. One is that it does tend to be more conducive to stories about individuals than it is to stories about groups, stories about complex social dynamics, stories about systems. Amnesty, and I actually served briefly on the board of Amnesty USA nearly a decade ago now, at a time it was this, I think, was very much a source of tension on the board between the old version of human rights, where the paradigmatic victim was an individual with a picture, on a poster, locked up, tortured, and the paradigmatic human rights violator was the state, whether it was the Soviet state or whether it was a Latin American state or an African state. That you had the dissident, the repressed dissident, with a name and a face, and the bad state, and very much the imagery of human rights was very much about individuals against the state, states trying to squash the individual. That was as a way to mobilize ordinary people. It was very effective, because we all are much, much better at relating to individuals than we are at relating to abstractions. It's easy to empathize with. It's easy to feel outraged when you hear the story of a particular individual who's been repressed, tortured, imprisoned, and so on by a repressive state. Yet at the same time, the period when I was on the Amnesty board, when the attention of the world more and more turns, this is 2002, 2003, to problems that were complicated, messy, structural in their nature, the role of the global small arms trade in fueling conflicts in Africa, or the role of resources, natural resources, in fueling conflicts and abuses that were often by non-state actors as much as they were by state actors. Messier, more complicated, harder to sit in your living room as a high school kid in Iowa or as a dentist in Albuquerque and get an easy grip on it and say, whoa, I get that one. That really hits me viscerally. And in turn, you had a real shift within the organization between a generation of passionate, gifted amateurs, if you will, people who grabbed onto this as a moral cause versus horrible people like me, that is the lawyers and the technocrats and the people who come in and say, no, it's not enough to just feel outraged about so-and-so. We have to think about the global economic system and the ways in which the dynamics at the WTO help enable and foster this and that and blah, blah, blah. And oh my goodness, this is very boring. It's much harder to get your hands on. So at one and the same time, I think that anti-political, individually oriented human rights discourse is indeed part of precisely what gives it its appeal at a moment when other more totalizing ideologies are becoming discredited. It also precisely contains the seeds of its own. That's its limitation as well. That it tends to draw attention away from systems, away from politics, away from bureaucracy, away from structure, and instead towards a more individualized understanding of right and wrong, and a more individualized understanding of what solutions might be. Let me close by just saying a few words, and I'd love to hear Sam and others talk about this a bit more. What might this mean for the future? I mean, is this a happy story or a sad story when we think about human rights? And Sam, in a way, implies that this is a little bit of a sad story, that human rights is already fading. Even at this very moment where you might think it is achieved success. Prominent human rights people integrated into the executive branch. Human rights courses at every university and law school around the country. Human rights as a career, enormously popular among young people, floods of students saying, how do I become a human rights person? Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, get thousands of applications for every job position, people vying to earn much too little money. This is it. Even at that same moment, I think Sam in some ways sees this as a discourse that has run its course, in a sense, precisely because it is bumped up against that limitation of, at some point, you need to make a choice, as he puts it. You need to choose between whether you're going to have a very minimalist frame that is focused on a small number of really catastrophic horrors, e.g. genocide, other mass atrocities, or else you need to, as he puts it, you need to move from morality to politics, from charisma to bureaucracy, and you need to focus on, I'm not quite sure I would agree that it's building utopia, but through a more maximalist political vision, one that does get you back into the dirty, messy, complicated, sometimes boring realm of system and structure. I do think that we're at that moment. I'm not sure that marks, though, I'm less, I think my sense is that Sam is a little bit pessimistic, thinks that we have gone, that it is too much to ask that the human rights discourse and movement shift from charisma to bureaucracy, in a sense, that won't happen, that is a choice, it's a stark choice, that the best human rights can do is revert a little bit to a more simple, more stark, and less ambitious agenda of saying, okay, we're going to kind of stake our ground in the anti-catastrophe with a kind of minimalist set of moral claims, and that's all we're going to do. I'm not sure I agree, and I partly, you could read the reduced human rights rhetoric by, for instance, the president compared to some earlier administrations. You could read that as defeat, or you could actually read that as, in a sense, the not never fully successful, but the partially successful internalization, bureaucratization. That always sounds like a dirty word to say something has turned into a bureaucracy, right? But bureaucracies are what get things done. slowly, inefficiently, badly, sloppily, etc., but they indeed are what gets things done, and the messy thing that we have called the government. And you could equally say that to some extent, if you hear less about human rights from top U.S. politicians, that may not be because human rights have failed. It may be because human rights have been more integrated into day-to-day business than they have been in the past, because we are beyond the point of the impassioned rhetoric and more at the point of thinking about how do you institutionalize this, how do you turn these commitments into structures, into doctrines, into plans, into system architectures, so that they're not the exceptional battle cry, but rather part of doing your day-to-day business. I'll stop there, but just say that I certainly see my own job as part of that project. I hope we don't completely lose the passion and the charisma, but I certainly see my own job as part of saying, let's take this from a passionate rhetoric and start doing the hard work of turning it into a day-to-day bureaucratic reality, although that is not always as rewarding day-to-day.
Thank you very much. Just point of information, you are the first person in your position. Are you?
I am.
Yeah, okay.
It's a new office.
Yeah, it's a new office. Okay. Sam, you want to respond before we open it up?
Sure. Well, I'll just respond briefly in favor of more discussion. I'm very grateful to both commentators who were very generous with me. I think I agree with almost everything Jerry said. He's an exceptionally discerning reader and really captures the main impulses in the book, including a bit of its timidity at times and the burial of certain of its arguments in favor of kind of more neutral sorts of narrative. I think I also can take on board his main criticism, which I'll connect to Rosa's comments in a bit. I really set myself as a historical problem how this idea came to be eligible for implementation in whatever way. And I don't really look too much, in part because the work hasn't been done by others, at NGO success or how outcomes might be measured from the perspective of the social movements who adopted the new idea. And I certainly don't look at outcomes once the powerful take on board the human rights idea. So in a sense, what impresses me about human rights in the 70s is the way it's sort of articulated as something that will defend us against power rather than something that would be implemented by the powerful. And of course, even NGOs have some sort of power, and certainly presidents do. So that's a considerable flaw, but it may not be if the problem is how the idea becomes eligible for assent in the first place. I agree with Rosa that technological change is a very important variable. At one point, I cite Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who says in the 70s, there are no more internal affairs in the world, and clearly he's alluding to, in part, novel information flows. And the problem, as Rosa also said, is that information can serve lots of ideologies. It's true that the authoritarian or totalitarian state may fear the spread of information about its own practices, but that may also be true of certain things that the democratic state is doing with its large intelligence and security apparatuses. And so a first worry is that technology is kind of a neutral player, at least until the FCC gets rid of network neutrality. And it may not be able, more important, to explain the spike in human rights in the 70s. So it seems as if technology might get perfected in some leaps and bounds, but certainly that's happening before the 70s, and it's happening since. And it's hard to know exactly how one would correlate it as a distinctive causal factor with the major spike, for example, in 1977. So my book ends with a little chart that shows just the sheer frequency with which the phrase human rights appeared in the newspaper. And in 1977, it appears 5 times more frequently than any prior year in history. And it seems as if technology could at best be kind of in the background of that shift, although surely you're right that it's relevance somehow. I am a historian, so I defer to experts like Rosa about the policy implications of the book. It seems to me that human rights, with this notion of a kind of pure moral set of norms asserted against power, do work very well in a critique from below of authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. And that was really what lent the idea such glamour beginning in the 1970s. But to come to Jerry's point, it seems to me it seeped out of that project. On the one hand, it's been connected to anti-genocide consciousness, which wasn't true in the 40s and arguably wasn't terribly prominent even by the 70s, but by the 90s it's one of the main associations. But if we look at articulations of human rights mainly outside this country, and notably in the global South, they're connected to social and economic rights and concerns about reconstruction. So my suggestion at the end of the book is that human rights become utopian insofar as they are, in a sense, saddled with the death of other ideologies, with the role of having an answer to anyone's project. And so I guess my suggestion is at the end, or I flirt with the possibility that we could somehow limit human rights to a core set of concerns that don't allow them to become the new utopias if human rights were, after all, invented to overcome that old kind of maximalist approach to change. Now, that's, of course, very hard in itself, because even commitment to an anti-genocidal imperative may commit us to war. It may commit us to investigating the structural causes of violence abroad. And in interventions, these are going to be inevitably political acts, which may be hard to keep minimal, or something that would fit with just a kind of pure moral baseline. And then, as Rosa notes, human rights has become bureaucratized. And I guess I'm not sure how to respond to her last comment about the bureaucratization of human rights, in a sense, being its success rather than its failure. The reason I would have concern about that is because lots of people in human rights, I think of a great international lawyer named Martti Koskiniemi, who think that ought not to happen to human rights, that human rights ought to be kept a kind of pure utopia for use in criticizing governmental actors like Rosa, who think that their goal is to humanize the world, in a sense, through bureaucratic action. And the suggestion is that if we allow bureaucrats to take over human rights, we'll lose the purchase this moral conception has over government, which now claims to be the agent of the norms rather than something subject to the norms. And that's, I think, a considerable worry to set against Rosa's rosier picture of the success through their governmentalization. But I leave that open.
In the words of the other Marx, you don't want to join any club that will have you.
Right. I don't play politics. I just think about it.
Right. Or they don't. Yeah. Please state your name and wait for the mic.
Dirk Moses, University of Sydney. I'm currently a fellow here in the Asia program. Unlike Secretary Brooks, I'm also a historian, like the others, and I do believe that history is important. It's important, for example, for putting into context perhaps some of Sam's statements. I've also had the advantage of reading the book, so there's some background there. Now, you said, Secretary Brooks, that the 70s were important because the technological changes allowed us to have a greater consciousness of what's going on in the world, globalization of consciousness to some extent, and now regimes of sovereignty limitation. Was that your term?
Yes, but I actually think the 70s are much less important than Sam thinks they are.
Okay, well, even if they go back earlier. But I mean,
the 90s are more important.
Oh, I see, the 90s. Well, I think we can go back, say, to the 1890s or even earlier. We know that there was an enormous controversy and concern in Christian Europe, to use the terms of the times, about atrocities against Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire, which led to sovereignty-limiting treaties against the Ottomans in the 1870s and the 1890s and so forth. And even before that, we had the especially British concern for the Christian Greeks and then the liberation of Greece. Now, this brings me to the question of humanitarianism and humanitarian concern, this is now directed more towards Sam, which comes up a lot in the book, less so in your talk today. I was wondering if you could flesh out the relationship in your mind between a general European, in those days Christian, humanitarian concern, usually for other Christians under Islamic rule at the time, and the discourse of human rights, which was not then used at the time, the term didn't exist, but comes up in the 70s. Of course, in the 1940s as well, but didn't become a movement. Now, this leads on to Jerry's point, which is about the continuities rather than discontinuities in a humanitarian sensibility you get in Europe, obviously elsewhere as well, but in its particular articulation in Europe, which manifests itself in human rights in the 70s, but actually has existed all along, which is why people like to trace the origins of human rights in antiquity or in Judaism or in Christianity or in the Enlightenment. And say, well, it's manifested itself in a particular way now, but in fact, it's really just a particular articulation of something that's been there all along. It's also concern about genocide, it's concern about development, it's concern about atrocities. The language may have changed, but the energy is the same. So I was wondering, just to wrap up this rather long-winded question, if you could comment on an accusation that someone may make that the book is very Western-centric. For example, it may be that in the West, the language of anti-colonial liberation gives way to that of human rights. But in parts of the world where there are continuing occupations, the language of anti-colonial liberation is alive and well. Think of Palestine, think of Kurdistan, think of Morocco and elsewhere. So it all depends on where you are in the world. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that question. So I think this also goes back to Jerry's point that, in a sense, this is a very literal-minded book. I'd say I take the phrase human rights and connected ideas as sort of proxies for thinking about important distinctions, but it may be that, in a sense, I miss important values that simply didn't yet express themselves in rights terms, let alone in terms of human rights. And there are a lot of cases there which are, I think, worth noting. I mean, you've raised the case of early humanitarian intervention studied by people like Gary Bass, but anti-slavery would be a good example. So I guess I would fit these kinds of causes, as you suggest, into 19th century politics and ask how much they really are like what human rights have meant once the phrase is coined and becomes popular. So as I noted, going back perhaps to the beginning of time of human history, and certainly since what scholars call the axial age, there are appeals to humanity. And that's certainly a characteristic of early humanitarian intervention. And my constant response to these things, which are plural and almost infinite in number, is let's ask what they mean in practice. So it's true that these early practices of humanitarian intervention do interfere with, let's call it, sovereign equality. But the fact is that they interfered with it because it didn't exist in the first place on the fringes of Christian Europe. And so these are all cases of kind of imperial rivalry at the fringes of Europe, and in particular about the famous Eastern question, about what will happen as the Ottoman Empire declines. Now later that's different, because the sorts of claims made against the Ottoman Empire in the name of humanity on behalf of Christians then start to get made against the doddering Spanish Empire in the Caribbean, and then later in the Philippines by the United States. The United States presidents and others copying the old British, especially, rhetoric against the Ottomans for these new sorts of seemingly imperial intervention. But they seem all restricted to inter-imperial rivalry in the end, and the expansion of sovereignty, so that these interventions, especially the Greek case, do lead to new states, and not just kind of imperial overstretch. But it's nevertheless crucial to put back in that context. That said, I think it's an important precedent, and it's not surprising that it's in a sense been rediscovered by the policy world and by historians in the quest to give a lineage to these newer ideas. But the suggestion is that they're only kind of precedents discovered after the fact, and because they seem to have a partial commonality with what we've been doing lately. Now, I wouldn't apologize for let's say the focus of the book, which is on the powerful. It's on the birth of a human rights movement and set of ideas and practices around them in the wealthy North Atlantic world. Now, it's legible from my book that there were alternative conceptions of human rights, notably anti-colonialist ones, that at the very moment of the triumph of amnesty and Carter and so on in the 70s, were triumphing at the United Nations in the creation proposed of a so-called new international economic order. But it seems to me that there's a reason or a justification for not being comprehensive, that it really does matter in the long view what doctrines and practices the powerful adopt in the world. If you think that, the powerful matter even for understanding what the non-powerful think and do. But that's to acknowledge your point that the book is not intended to be comprehensive.
Rosa, do you want to respond?
Sure. Certainly think history matters, but is less salient for some projects than for others. Two quick point. Well, one very quick one and one slightly less quick one. At one point many years ago, and I haven't unfortunately duplicated this for 7 or 8 years. I did a LexisNexis search similar to yours for the term human rights. Comparing it not from the pre-1977 period to, you go up through 1985, but looking at it since then as well. And my recollection, and I could be wrong about this, but that the real huge spike, you get 5 times more in 1977 than in any previous period, but then you get 50 times more once you get into the 1990s, which is why I'm a little less persuaded that the awarding of the Nobel Prize to amnesty either triggered the rise of the explosion of the modern human rights movement or exemplified any high watermark. I think that the Nobel Committee sometimes acts in ways that are well and ahead of trends, sometimes acts in ways that never actually set off trends. So I see that as a little bit more random, I think. But let me. More important point. I'll make a point in defense of bureaucracy, which is a terrible word because it has a negative. Nobody ever wants to defend bureaucracy. But let me put this a little bit differently. In defend of institutional architectures, take the minimalist conception, and I think you raised this point in your earlier comments, Sam. Of okay, what if we say, well, let's restrict human rights to the minimalist moral conception of preventing genocide? Well, how do you prevent a genocide? It takes machineries of government. It takes machineries of power. It takes human beings. Even whether you want to look at it at the, take something like Rwanda, genocide that we notably failed to prevent. There were many steps along the way, as is very well known now, which things could have been done, ranging from the more maximalist version, send in the Marines frame, to the more minimalist version, jam the radio stations used as command and control networks by the genocidaires, which probably would have dramatically slowed the pace of the killings, perhaps creating enough time and breathing space for other forms of intervention to succeed. Well, how do you get the political decision-making made? How do you get the jamming technologies to be deployed? How do you get the Marines there? What helicopters bring them? What logistical train supplies them? Et cetera. That all of those things are, they don't happen by magic. They don't happen by themselves. That they happen when you put into place systems that make them happen, and they don't happen when you decide that you're not interested in that. And I say this is turning to the work of the office that we created quite recently at the Pentagon. One of our big challenges is precisely the challenge of how do you go from rhetorical commitment to changes in policies and procedures that actually matter. And one of the projects that we're in the process of developing is actually a project on atrocity prevention and response. You can go around the U.S. government, you will not find a single senior official who will tell you anything other than the U.S. government is absolutely committed to preventing atrocities. Of course we are. Nobody disagrees with that. But we don't have, at the moment, we don't have a machinery that does that with any degree of effectiveness. We don't routinize atrocity prevention in our military planning or our diplomatic or economic planning. We don't have systems that support that. We don't have shared early warning indicators that tell us, hey, here's when you go from I'm not really worried about that, the odds of something horrific happening are pretty low, we don't have to think about it, to, oh my gosh, this is now at the point where we do have to think seriously about it. If you want to use the very wide range of tools that a powerful country such as the United States has for atrocity prevention and other humanitarian purposes, say, for instance, you want to be able to jam hate radio if you believe it is about to trigger imminent atrocities. You want to be able to use satellite imagery or other forms of surveillance technologies to deter atrocities. All of those things take money, they take planners, they take resources, and what we are. When I say defend bureaucracy, I hate to summon up this image of these kind of slothful, inefficient, federal bureaucrats, and we've got a few of them, but rather that if you don't figure out how you embed that into system architecture, it just won't happen, and we will face Rwanda over and over and over again, where by the time something registers as a crisis, it's already too late. It's already too late because we've missed all the opportunities for prevention. We're at the point where any response is so politically costly, so economically costly, that we make excuses for not doing anything. So in that sense, I don't mean to present a particularly rosy picture. I think we have a very, very long way to go on all of these fronts. But I do think that if the human rights discourse remains only a source of moral inspiration and doesn't get translated into the more tedious stuff of day-to-day institutional architecture, then it will continue to be, as Jerry put it, perhaps a form of therapy and self-actualization, but not, in fact, a form of changing anything in the world.
And what you're talking about is, of course, being done at the national level. So, this gets back to Saif's point about the kind of tension between human rights and national. It's a national intervention against the sovereignty of another country, but it would be even more difficult to try to mobilize these kinds of resources at an international level. Look at how difficult it is for the UN to get much of anything done. Yes, over here, please. Please state your name.
Richard Claude. I'm currently a fellow at University of California, Berkeley. I appreciate Professor Moyn's historian's appropriate attempt to draw boundary lines around the work you're about to undertake. But to me, if I pick up a book on history, let's say American history, a grade school book, I hope to find out not only who was the first in North America or who discovered America. I would like to know about what's going on in current history as well, and it's certainly gone beyond those who have done exploration to our western frontiers. The point I want to make is that the lawyers, I will grant you that the lawyers were there first. I will grant you that the lawyers are important in terms of charter writing and in terms of pursuing the objectives of Amnesty International, for example. But now, and really, yes, since your tipping point date of 1970, quite appropriate. Now we have statisticians for human rights. We have physicians for human rights, who, by the way, shared in the Nobel Peace Prize along with others in the landmine amnesty award. I would like to know, from a historical perspective, who else is out there besides the lawyers? Surely there must be many, and I'm here to tell you that there are. The American Association for the Advancement of Science has just brought together a committee of about at least 15 professional science associations, many of whom are preparing to commit their membership, whether in the field of biochemistry, statistics, or others, to possible pro bono work in the field of human rights, working with specific human rights NGOs. There might be some lawyers there, but it's dominated by the technicians and the scientists.
Great, excellent comment. One point just about how I proceed in the book. It's true that I have a chapter about American international lawyers and how human rights become central doctrinally to the notion of the building blocks of the international legal order. But actually, I subordinate lawyers to other actors in the book, and I suggest, along with lots of other approaches, say to domestic constitutional law, that actually social movements on the ground matter much more than we have appreciated to even the formulation of doctrinal structures within international law discourse. So in that sense, lawyers are not idolized in this book. Instead, the heroes, if you will, are social movements from below, grassroots forces, as well as politicians who, in a sense, wrest the concept away from the United Nations and the few international lawyers who had cared about international human rights prior to the 70s, and bring it to a much larger a set of global actors, who include many more international lawyers than ever before. So I think you're getting at something very important, which is that after this era, as if you like, the last idealism standing, the notion of international human rights does begin to infiltrate both civil society and government in all sorts of unexpected ways it had never before. And that's really what ought to be dramatic to us in trying to understand how to think about the chronology of the field. Now, I would argue that we need to be slightly nuanced about this, because in some sense, the grassroots character of human rights is at its strongest and most unalloyed in the 70s, when Amnesty is accreting huge numbers, hundreds of thousands of new members. And the concept hasn't yet been bureaucratized. There's a human rights office in the State Department that's actually founded by Henry Kissinger. But otherwise, until Carter, there aren't even human rights bureaucrats. And now, of course, there are multiple ones, and they have different names and places in government. And the question is, how we coordinate that story of bureaucratization with the history of grassroots. So it seems to me that the grassroots element of human rights has been in decline for a while, even though lots of professional associations and other kinds of advocacy organizations do incorporate it as an agenda item. Now, last point about this, which is to come back to Rosa's first comment from a bit ago, is that a chart which illustrates the invocation of human rights goes through 2005. And it's remarkable that at the level of the New York Times, there's much more of a presence of the phrase in the newspaper in 1977 than any year even after, even though compared to earlier, there's a salience that human rights have that's unprecedented through the present. Still, that less than in this kind of banner year because of Carter and Amnesty. Still, I perfectly agree that the 1990s are the years of real ideological triumph of human rights, when the sorts of percolations to which you're alluding become possible. So I'm not trying to champion the 70s against the 1990s. I'm trying to look at the 70s as a kind of hinge or breaking moment when the 90s become possible. And so I would see lots of continuities between the 70s and the 90s rather than forcing us to somehow choose between them.
Yeah, right here. And then, yeah, we'll move across, yeah.
Jim Lowen, I wrote a number of books, most recently The Confederate and Neo-Confederate Reader. My question is, I know it's great to make your topic new, but I'm not sure how the crusade against slavery and against the slave trade, and then it kind of morphed into the crusade against imperialism, how those two, or maybe three campaigns, aren't pretty close precedents. I'm kind of with her. I don't know. I don't care exactly, but I mean, those are. I couldn't separate what distinctions you were making that caused you not to even mention the slave trade, except in response to this fellow's question, the crusade against the slave trade.
Okay, well, I have to be sort of brief on this, although I recognize the great importance of the question. I mean, I see it as a precedent. If we're trying to account for the prominence of human rights in our world, there's no causal force that the slave trade plays, that the crusade against it. And in fact, in 19th century politics, it was much less frequent for it to give rise to anti-imperialist sentiment than for it to be linked to imperialism. And most advocates of crusading against the slave trade were really out for better versions of empire, and that's why many of the advocates against the slave trade really did support a kind of the expansion of the British Empire, and arguments against slavery were very, very commonly mobilized, for example, in the colonization of the African continent after the 1880s. Which is not to say that there weren't alternative currents coming out of it, as you suggest. And another example would be the campaign against so-called white slavery, or what we would now call human trafficking. I guess my objection to kind of citing this as the true breakthrough is it's a single cause. It's a cause advocacy movement, although it does clearly pioneer some important tools that the human rights movement discovers later in its own right, notably what we would call naming and shaming. But it doesn't seem to me not to give rise to anything remotely like international human rights law. And it seems to be, by and large, pursued either domestically or within empire.
But surely it does. I mean, Great Britain and France and Portugal and so on agree to patrol the Atlantic, and the United States allegedly agrees to participate in that, and that's pretty much international law.
There are famous cases which a Stanford law professor named Jenny Martinez has dug out of these bilateral commissions, and there's lots of historical dispute about what their meaning and limits at the time were. Sorry? It's not about what they achieved and it didn't. It's about what they were trying to achieve, which most scholars see as being part of the consolidation of imperial spaces. That's what the states involved were trying to achieve, not just humanitarian aims alone. Still, I wouldn't want to suggest that there are no precedents. That's not the argument. It's trying to understand the presence of human rights in their meaning in our world. It doesn't seem like we can draw any line between the crusade and what human rights mean today, and we have to kind of trace a line that's erratic and goes in very different directions before we can get to our world, and that's more the kind of point I'm trying to make.
Just for a second, are today's invocations of human rights causes so free of international politics? I mean, you seem to be setting a standard for purity that seems almost unattainable. I mean, is it always that disinterested? Is it?
No, of course not. That's not.
What's a quintessential example of an international human right, of a human rights movement now? I mean, what would you?
Well, there is. I mean, it'd be hard to choose a quintessential example, not least because governments, as Rosa suggested, have incorporated the notion and just the sheer pluralization of movements that claim to be human rights movement or understand themselves as human rights movement. I mean, one major impulse is the monitoring impulse, which we could associate both with State Department reports, which start in the 70s on the governmental side, and then monitoring, naming, and shaming, which you would probably best associate first with the Helsinki process and then with today's Human Rights Watch. And it seems to me there we can see a precedent in anti-slavery agitation, which really did, as far as we know, kind of pioneer these methods of agitation. But there's no sign that there's an attempt to set up a kind of superstate regime of international law, especially not courts, except for these bilateral commissions, that would provide a kind of standing regime that would put states in their place thanks to this, superstate set of norms embodied in law. That seems to be quite new.
Rosa's shaking her head.
I guess I'm inclined to also see the abolitionist movement, the anti-slave trade movement, the humanitarian movement of the mid 19th century, late 19th century, Geneva Conventions, Hague Conventions, as very much the precursors of the modern human rights movement, both in terms of methodology and in terms of the degree in which these became transnational moral causes that very much transcended borders by definition. I think it seems to me that maybe you're attaching too much importance to the question of did they or did they not consciously aspire to establish international legal structures that had the power of law to reach into sovereign states, which it strikes me across the board you could say is certainly not an invention of the 20th century. I mean, you could, again, with the caveat that I'm not a historian, it seems to me, going back to earlier eras of human history, more church-dominated, et cetera, you certainly had transnational legal structures of varying sorts. But in the sort of post-Westphalian universe, you lose that. That's regained across the board, beginning in the 20th century, whether you want to look at trade law, international, public international law, trade law, whether you want to look at international environmental law. So I don't think that that's unique. I think that there's a different question, which is also a very interesting question, which is why is the 20th century, and particularly the second half of the 20th century, this is a Lou Henkin question, right? Why is that the century of international law, period? Which is separate from the question of whether somehow there's something new about the human rights idea, which doesn't have precursors. I guess that's what I meant earlier by saying, to me, I'm not entirely sure what's at stake in whether we decide. When I say I'm not sure it matters, it's not that it doesn't matter. I'm not clear what's at stake if we say that the modern human rights discourse can or cannot be traced in a straight line right back to these earlier transnational moral social movements. What's at stake? How we answer that question? I throw that out to you.
Right. Well, I leave this question open because I think it's really the discussion I meant to open without concluding it. But I'd want to distinguish between, let's say, precedents and sources. That's to say, whenever something big happens in the world, we can look back for precedents, and we'll find them. We'll find partial commonalities between what we want to do and what others have done in the past. But those precedents aren't sources in the sense that they don't account for why it is that we're seeking things in the past or why we've adopted the aims and practices that we have. And to me, it does matter. So that one big theme of the book, you might say, as follows. Why did individual rights, get severed from the revolutionary legacy? I mean, that seems to me to be one core theme of the book. So that's one reason why there's, in all these humanitarian campaigns, there's almost never an assignment of rights to suffering people abroad or slaves. They're humanitarian, but they're not about the rights of man, which are so closely linked, as I was suggesting in my talk to the state. And one reason that matters is that the revolutionary legacy is about a political agenda, about setting up citizenship spaces. And it seems to me we'll never understand contemporary human rights if we don't kind of compare and contrast it to that older attempt. Or consider the myth that human rights ideas in the 40s were a response to genocide. Well, that would be interesting if true, and it might help us in this minimalist campaign to tether them closely to catastrophe prevention. And it's surely true that human rights are now connected because of recent memories of the Holocaust to genocide prevention. But it seems to me we're in a different debate if we get the chronology right and the sources right. So if my argument about the story of political foreclosure and search for moral alternatives in the 70s is right, we can explain ourselves a lot better. We can explain kind of the debate we've been having about whether we bureaucratize human rights, whether we allow the state actors to invoke them to explain or justify their behavior, or whether we let external moral movements invoke them against the state. That seems to me the right set of questions, but it only comes into view if we drop these stories about the revolutionary or genocidal origins of these concerns. And so I think that's ought to be a good reason to care about origins.
Yeah, right here.
Henry Hedger, researcher at NARA. I opened October 23rd's Washington Post and noticed all the WikiLeaks, all the descriptions of U.S. activities in the Iraq occupation, violations of human rights is the basically routine. I wondered, do you have much to say about that? Meanwhile, the Iraq government is discussed, and they're sort of reproducing what we do on a grander scale, and I wondered if you have something to say about that. Is there a need for reforms or some new international body to follow this and prevent it?
Well, I think I should let my colleagues tell you what the right answer is, but I'll take a stab. It seems to me the WikiLeaks revelations, although apparently they don't tell us, except at the level of detail much we didn't know before, matter because they're a bit of a challenge for Rosa's story about the necessary bureaucratization of human rights, in part by stopping talking about them in public. Because if the descriptions are correct, it sounds like the association between human rights and power is going to be a double-edged sword. They're bureaucratized, but let's say not enough yet. And that seems to be one way of thinking about that story. But you might think about it in another way, which is about the recent history in Iraq as the attempt to negotiate a new era of post-colonial sovereignty. So actually, Iraq was the first nation in the interwar period that was released from empire under the supervision of an international organization, then League of Nations, in, I think, 1932. And you could argue that down the road, human rights really have the meaning they do today in a world of states that are formally equal but informally unequal. And we have debates in the developed West about what to do about failed states or states that are imperfect in providing the rights protection that we hopefully do at home. And so you might take revelations about inhumanity abroad, which of course date back a long time to the 19th century, as Dirk Moses was saying, to kind of pose a specific challenge to us today. We haven't yet figured out how to negotiate the dissemination of sovereignty that happened mainly as a result of decolonization, and are concerned that individuals still deserve protection in a world of sovereign nation states. And so that seems also a way of thinking about it. But you may have better.
Well, two things. And to make a somewhat legalistic point, most international lawyers would assert that during wartime, human rights law is not the applicable law, that speaking of human rights violations is not the relevant legal framework, that the legal framework is the law of armed conflict, which is far more permissive. I think as a moral matter, that's sort of neither here nor there. I mean, Paul Kahn, who is one of the, gives a blurb quote to Sam's book on the back and was a professor of mine in law school, wrote a terrific article actually after the first Gulf War in which he essentially makes a point that on some level is terribly obvious, but I think is also, as a moral matter, is extremely important, which is the amount of human suffering that is legal under the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, is staggering. That the international humanitarian law, humanitarian impulses notwithstanding, is a set of rules that govern violence, but are not aimed at reducing it or reducing suffering. Anyway, the point there just being that I'm not sure that the characterization of the many things that have claims upon our conscience in Iraq are most usefully characterized as human rights violations because you have some competing legal frameworks, which is not the same as saying that makes them okay. That means we should go home at night and say, well, that's fine then. It's not illegal. No harm, no foul from a legal perspective. But I guess to me, in some ways, part of the story of tragedies and mistakes and crimes, some crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, is a further argument for the importance of institutionalizing training. Let me give another quick example, Abu Ghraib. I believe that how you structure a detention center, how you train the people who staff it, has enormous implications for the likelihood that you will get appalling abuse or not. Abuse doesn't just happen out of nowhere because bad people. So it's not that a bad person shows up and then you get abuse. Systems enable or discourage abuse. There are better and worse people, but how we design our systems makes a tremendous difference. And I think that one of the things, again, that we are just beginning to grapple with as a government is how do we engineer our systems in ways that minimize the likelihood that there will be out of control and rampant abuse, as opposed to enable out of control and rampant abuse. And I think if you look at some of what happened in Iraq, you can, in hindsight, certainly, and some of us said at the time, you could see all sorts of ways in which we were creating institutions that, on the contrary, maximize the likelihood that there would be horrific abuses. Only other final point to make, and this relates to your point, sir, about look at the evidence, plenty of evidence that the Iraqi government is not exactly doing all the things we would like it to do either. I think the human rights discourse, when you earlier, Sam, said that one of the reasons that you don't see the anti-slavery discourse of the 19th century as a precursor to today's human rights discourse is because, if anything, the anti-slavery discourse was often used to justify imperialism and empire rather than to undermine it. Certainly there are plenty of anti-colonialist critics today who would say the same of the Western human rights frame. And indeed, the Iraqi government has made that argument that it's a Western construct, and you are using the discourse of human rights to justify occupation and meddling, whereas if you again flip back to the self-determination, individual rights frame becomes less important. So I don't think that's any. I think that the human rights, whether the universalist human rights discourse is sort of, to oversimplify, on the side of power and imperialism or on the side of former colonial states, et cetera, remains a very, very live debate.
Jerry, did you want to jump in on this?
Only that it brings us back to where Sam Moyn's book begins, and that is with Hobbes' Leviathan. And the challenge of creating a sovereign state which can control civil war and hence provide a minimum of individual security remains a tremendous challenge, and especially in those parts of the world that are made up of multi-ethnic states, or where you have a kind of ethnic, a kind of religious sectarianism that amounts to very much the same thing. That's very hard to do. And if you actually read the WikiLeaks story, even in the papers, you see that most of the abuse had to do with the role of various groups in Iraq, various sectarian groups doing terrible things to one another. Some of them in the government, some of them not, under conditions of what they regard as civil war. So when we talk about, to go back to what Rosa said too, when we talk about minimalist objectives of anti-catastrophism and so on, they're very hard to do in many parts of the world.
Sam, did you want?
Well, I agree with what Jerry said. The difference is that you have lots of international actors in the present circumstance who are interested in what happens in Iraq, including departing Americans. So it's not just a kind of Hobbesian problem of the people of Iraq, but a kind of matter of international concern. Now that, of course, is not new, because in the case I mentioned of the original emancipation of Iraq in 1932, the British, whose sphere of influence in the mandate system of the League of Nations Iraq had been, were terrifically concerned about this Assyrian minority, and essentially those people were exterminated. About Rosa's point, I just have two brief remarks. From a purely doctrinal point of view, Rose is absolutely right. And one very familiar point made is that international humanitarian law is in theory non-derogable, whereas human rights law is. But lots of doctrinalists, I think of my old law of war teacher, whose name is Ted Marone, have been agitating for an erosion of the border between international humanitarian law, or the law of war, and human rights law. The second point is about imperialism, which I think she's absolutely right in the spirit of her comments, but I would make one amendment, which is that humanitarian claims in the 19th century were warrants for direct formal intervention and occupation and ultimately annexation of lots of places, notably Africa, the whole continent. Whereas now, these imperial debates, or debates between, liberals and anti-imperialists, all kind of assume the validity of formal sovereignty. And if there's interference, it's not direct imperial annexation. Well, right, but that was for, ultimately not 5 years, not 100 years. And it was always with the aim that the normative assumption was always, that there was going to be a new state created. And so at best, then we argue about neo-colonialism, which is still an important debate, but seems to be very different from the sorts of debates we would have in thinking about 19th century politics.
Yeah, over here.
Professor Moyn, I thought when you
identify yourself, please.
Tino Calabria. I thought when you were referring to a professor who taught you, you might have been talking about Louis Henkin, who at the age of 92 just died a couple of weeks ago. And he was a pioneer of human rights law, as you know. But bringing it up to, say, the beginning of human rights as a declaration by the UN, while it's true that people like Eleanor Roosevelt were heavily involved in constructing that, she was one of the first to recognize that it would never get ratified by the Congress, and it wasn't. And we didn't do much better, 30, 40 years ago, when Jimmy Carter signed the convention you referred to, because it never got ratified and still hasn't been. And in fact, when the Obama administration submitted a human rights report to the Human Rights Council just a month ago or so, there was an uproar about his kowtowing to, and I sit here in a building that's dedicated to Woodrow Wilson, and there's Glenn Beck who hates it. There are the Tea Partiers who hate not only what this stands for, not knowing that Woodrow Wilson had anything to do with it, but certainly hate the UN. I'm just kind of despondent about the progression of human rights in the U.S. You spoke, or at least the way I heard you, it sounded like there was an upward progression in how it's been accepted, that we bureaucratized it even. But I don't see that in the nation at large. I don't feel that in the constituency that's going to be voting on November 2nd. I mean, how can you put these two things together, that there is a history to it and it looks like it's good, but we live in a time in which all of this is downplayed and damned?
I'm just going to take one last question, Thomas.
It maybe falls down a little bit
Yeah.
from that.
Andrew, can you? Yeah.
My name's Tom Adams, and my question maybe follows a little bit on that. There's so much to chew on. It's very provocative talk, and one thing that just that came back to me is Kofi Annan's remarks, I think, when he was retiring, and he was, I can't remember the exact date, but just saying one of the issues that just had to be addressed was the UN's role not only in protecting sovereignty, but of protecting the rights that may conflict with sovereignty. And it struck me that connecting that with what you'd said about the Charter and the Declaration, I don't quite agree with you on that, because it seemed to me that that did come very much out of the World War experience from all of the debates, that there was very great concern that aggression was a problem of the attack on a sovereign nation, so that sovereignty had to be protected. But the other side of the coin was that, as in the preamble of the Declaration, much of the misery, I think the quote was, has been created by the disregard of human rights, and that was very much an internal thing of individual human rights. Well, all this just leads to a real question I have for you that's one of curiosity, because I'm sure you both know a lot about this. I'm wondering whether the human rights groups now that are outside of, that are non-governmental, in fact, have a concern for how to strengthen the bureaucratic structure on an international level. That's particularly relating to the question you were raising about empowering the UN in some way to be more effective and not have the enforcement of individual human rights be a matter of one sovereignty saying we're going to take care of this, but rather there being an international framework for intervening if necessary to protect human rights. Are the human rights groups interested in that? Can I make a quick comment?
Yeah. Jerry has to go, so yeah.
No, gentlemen, your question seems to me to be fantastic, because it doesn't look at the actual constitution of the UN Human Rights Council, which is made up of some of the greatest violators of human rights in the world. So you're out of touch with reality. Oh, well, you didn't recognize it in the way you formulated your question.
Sam, yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, these are really hard questions. I knew Lou, and if you're interested in Lou Henkin, the only archival work I did for the book was actually about Lou's career, and I went to his funeral the other day, and there is a sense in which he was a pivotal figure, but what I try to show actually is that he actually was kind of a latecomer in his career to international human rights law. This is not to say we shouldn't idolize him, but note that he was part of history, just like we all are. Conservative opposition since the 40s to international human rights is a significant feature of American history. There's no doubt about that. And it's not that the Tea Party is ignorant of Woodrow Wilson's internationalism. Quite to the contrary. If you read Sean Walentz's article in the recent New Yorker, they sort of lay, fascism at the feet, ultimately, of Woodrow Wilson and all of his terrible democratic successors. Ultimately, I think we have to place that United States debate within a larger context. I mean, there's no doubt that for domestic political purposes, it's a crucial debate to have and to think about historically. I mean, in the 50s, there was something called the Bricker Amendment, which is very relevant to this story. But what I've tried to do is place the debate in a larger international context, in particular one including Western Europeans, since paradoxically it's Western European conservatives who really save the idea of human rights after Americans leave it behind. And so that's part of the story. I give a kind of deflationary reading to the origins of the United Nations to kind of put these very inflationary and romantic versions that have been told since the 1990s maybe in a more persuasive context, and you'd either agree with them or disagree with them. Ultimately, the UN didn't succeed, as Jerry's comment suggests, in setting up institutions that would plausibly be or enforcement mechanisms for the rights that whose proclamation it sponsored. And that was certainly most of all true for the first 20 years after the Universal Declaration, when there was a Human Rights Commission, but in the words of its leader, it was the greatest waste paper basket ever invented, because petitions were sent and the commission had no power to consider them. Of course, when it got power, the Human Rights General Assembly had gone in part in a kind of third worldist direction, which, as Jerry suggests, could be very open, notably from the perspective of American actors, to charges of double standards. Now, that's not to say there haven't been very significant institutional innovations at the level of the UN. I mean, one thinks of the first International Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Committee it set up, which was supposed to be somehow insulated from the more political deliberations of what's now the Human Rights Council. But clearly, I think the bigger story would have to be about the search for alternative mechanisms. That's my big story, because we can't really tell a persuasive history of the huge explosion of interest in human rights except by seeing the UN's, in a sense, failure to develop an adequate discourse and institutional set of mechanisms kind of superseded by a host of other actors, whether governmental ones or grassroots ones, which in a sense bypass the United Nations because of its long history of doing little. And so this could be wrong. Certainly it does the symbolic work of creating the Universal Declaration, but it doesn't succeed in galvanizing people around the world to mobilize for the idea. Somehow we have to trace the causation of that event to other sources than the existence of the UN or its internal processes, which is not to say that they're not important, certainly not now.
A topic for another book, perhaps, another discussion. We must bring this one to an end. Please join us outside for wine and cheese, and please join me in thanking our panel.